Let's discuss Fyodor Dostoevsky's book, The Idiot. First, for those of you who haven't read it yet, I want to give you some advice. The key to understanding The Idiot is preparation. It is imperative that you read the Wikipedia entry on The Idiot at some point before or after reading the book. Because if you don't know what Fyodor Dostoevsky was going through in his life while writing the book, you won't fully appreciate what this book is about. Me personally, I didn't even understand the ending until I read the wiki. Also, don't be embarrassed to check the Spark Notes or the Cliff Notes websites on it. This is a deep book, so don't be embarrassed to do that. And finally, my last piece of advice is that while you read this book, you take out a piece of paper and write down the names of the characters as they appear, or maybe a short description of where they first appeared. This is a very simple thing you can do to keep track of all the characters because it gets confusing with all the Russian names. Who is who? I want to discuss mostly 4 aspects of this book: the twists the book takes, Dostoevsky's near-death experience, Prince Mushkin being a simp, and the efficacy of the ending. So let's get started. A lot of the background information I got for this book was from Jordan Peterson. He loves Dostoevsky and sings praises to him whenever he can. He once criticized Ayn Rand for saying that her novels were not real literature, that her characters were too one-dimensional, unlike Dostoevsky's characters. So I read this book, hoping to see for myself, are Dostoevsky's characters complex, or are they one-dimensional? Well, to answer that question, first you need to know something about Dostoevsky's writing style. Dostoevsky, I couldn't believe this, but Dostoevsky was a true believing Christian. Historians say he really did believe in God. So what Dostoevsky usually does is he will have a conviction that is close to his heart and he will write a whole book trying to disprove it. Jordan Peterson loves this about Dostoevsky, the fact that Dostoevsky will never resort to straw man fallacies. He will genuinely do his best to attack his own beliefs. And there's something to be said about this. I once started reading Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. It was very rational and very logical, and for that reason, I think it was ineffective. Don't get me wrong, I myself am an atheist. I think Richard Dawkins is fighting the good fight. And I might be wrong, because there's countless Christians who have become atheists from reading his books. But the point I'm getting at is that his book was full of low-hanging fruit arguments, shallow arguments. The arguments in the book are stuff like, if God exists, why do bad things happen to good people? Or how could God let things like the Holocaust happen? Or why are there contradictions in the Bible? Now, do you really think there's any Christians out there who haven't already heard these arguments? You need to give Christians some credit. In the denomination I used to go to, we would teach children the answers to these questions. A child could tell you why bad things happen to good people. These are shallow arguments because in his heart, Dawkins doesn't really empathize with Christians. He thinks Christians are dumb. It's like the moral of Ender's Game, to defeat your enemy, you have to love your enemy and empathize and be genuine in your quest for truth, which is where the genius of Fyodor Dostoevsky comes from. Dostoevsky truly believes in God, and his books are a genuine attempt at attacking his most dearly held beliefs. So what is he attacking in this book? He is attacking a cornerstone of Christianity, which is Christian love towards your neighbor, forgiveness. Dostoevsky has a Jesus-like figure, the Prince Mushkin, aka the Idiot, who will love and forgive all those who wrong him. And it happens so much that you end up yelling at the pages and you end up angry at him and you end up repulsed, abhorred, disgusted by how loving he is. Throughout the whole book, other characters call Prince Mushkin an idiot. And when they do, you end up thinking, oh, they're just being cruel, he's just misunderstood. You feel bad for him. But at the end, after you see him forgive so many people, you find yourself yelling at the pages and you find yourself calling him an idiot. And in that regard, this book absolutely nails the ending. The ending truly was genius. Another thing you need to know about Dostoevsky's writing style is that this book is essentially his own little simulation. He's playing The Sims while writing this book. What Dostoevsky did in this book was set up a party and have 8 characters show up and let them act how they would act. So like the drunkard character gets drunk at the party, the swindler character asks to borrow money, and the nihilist character tries to kill himself. This book was written in 4 sections, and the 4 sections kind of repeated in this way. There was a lot of parallels between each act, having a big party as the setting, someone makes a scene, and then a group of hoodlums shows up and cause havoc at the end. Dostoevsky would often have a big number of characters interacting concurrently at these parties. They say that Dostoevsky would often start writing without knowing what each character would do. Jordan Peterson explained that oftentimes Dostoevsky's characters were archetypes. They were meant to represent a stereotype. And so you might say, well, that's not realistic, to have a character that is a walking stereotype. But if you think of the character as the embodiment of an ideology, or as an embodiment of a group of people who act a certain way, then that character is, in a way, more real than any one person. He's like a composite person, as Jordan Peterson put it. So are the characters complex, or are they one-dimensional? I think in some ways they are both. The young 20-year-old girl is going to act naive, the old womanizer is going to keep being a womanizer, and the Christ-like figure is going to be Christ-like. In this way, they will be predictable. But in another way, they were unpredictable because of the following characteristic that Dostoevsky had in his writing. You see, reading this book, you notice a pattern. It's what I call flip-flopping. Wikipedia calls this temporality. It's all the unexpected twists and turns the book takes. There are so many instances when you think the plot will go one way and it suddenly goes a completely opposite way. So, by the way, there's going to be spoilers, so maybe skip like 40 seconds or something. I'll give you time. So examples of this are like how Aglaya on the green bench says that she'll marry Ganya and then tells the prince, just kidding, I made that up. Or how Natasha Felipena says she'll marry the prince and then doesn't. Or how you think the money's burned in the fireplace, but then you find out that it didn't really burn. Or how Hippolyte pulls out a gun and fires, but then it misfires. Or how Mushkin breaks a vase and you think he ruined the party, then he doesn't, but then he does. This book is full of flip-flops. Dostoevsky wrote this book in 4 parts, and he had to meet deadlines, delivering each of the 4 parts individually to the publisher. And I wonder if all the flip-flopping was due to time restraints or even laziness. Like maybe he would write the plot going a certain way, would then see how he feels about it, and would then, instead of erasing what he already wrote, would then just continue but negating what he already wrote. There were 2 ways in which this flip-flopping made the book better. The first way is that the flip-flopping made the characters more realistic. In real life, people aren't all that hardcore. Real people aren't absolutists. They're more forgiving. They flip-flop. For example, Ganya redeemed himself by not taking that huge bag of money from the fire pit, right? So you think, well, Ganya is going to be a good moral character from now on. But then Ganya says he regrets not debasing himself for the money. So, well, now he's kind of somewhere in the gray now, I guess. Another example is how Hippolyte, hated the prince for being so nice to him, but then forgave the prince. I mean, this was one of the main characteristics of Hippolyte, and he just changes like that. Madame Yepenchin also would end up furious with the prince in a number of scenes, but in the end she would come around and forgive him off screen. So they weren't all one-dimensional. Life has a lot of half measures, ambiguity. Natasha Felipena was staunch in her love for the prince, and for most of the book tried to keep away from him as to not hurt him. She tried to distance herself to save him from her self-destructive tendencies. But then towards the end, she just flipped on that position. She gave in, she had a strong conviction, but reneged it. And then she flipped again and again. Dostoevsky and his flip-flops, man. And in fact, most of these characters never really leave. Even though they have screwed the prince over, they're like, the bad guys of the book. Like Keller, they're the bad guys of the book, and yet they're present at the prince's marriage. They're his best men, even. In that way, this book is kind of realistic to real life. Because in real life, even though you might fight with your family, you forgive them. You're not that hardcore about it. If you fight with a friend for money or anything, you eventually come around, you forgive them, and you get over it. The second way in which the flip-flopping made the book better is that all the flip-flopping makes the plot more realistic. In a way, it's less realistic. The frequency at which the plot keeps taking unexpected turns, it seems forced. But on the other hand, it's more realistic because it captures the unexpected nature of real life. So as an example, right, my girlfriend was applying for jobs, and since college, she had a desire to work for, well, let's call them Company X, right? She really wanted to work for Company X. So, she leaves her old job and starts applying for jobs, and lo and behold, she landed an interview with Company X on a Friday. For a second, she and I both thought the stars had aligned and that this was a sign she was finally going to work at her dream job. And then that very Tuesday, remember the interview was Friday, on Tuesday, she had a job offer from another completely unrelated place that had nothing to do with it. And she took it. It was a great offer. And that's it. That's life. That's life. Another example, think about it. How many times have you dated someone and in your mind started finding signs proving that this new person was the one? This person was going to be your soulmate. All the timing was right. They were single just in the window when you were also single, and you hit it off and you start wondering what your kids will look like, and then you break up with the person. That's how life works. It's full of unexpected turns, and you end up experiencing, Dostoevskian twist, I guess. The point is, this book captures the unexpected turns of life. It's full of unexpected turns. At one point, you think the plot is going one way, and then it goes another way. These people are going to get married, and then they don't, and it's the opposite are going to get married. So in that regard, this was, in a way, more realistic. Shifting gears onto another topic now, this book was very personal for Dostoevsky because he gave the prince fits of epilepsy, and Dostoevsky, in real life, had epilepsy. I didn't understand the ending of the book until I learned that. So there's going to be some spoilers from now on, so ask yourself if you want to hear the ending. I'll give you some time now to decide. Do you want the ending to be spoiled or not? Anyways, so Dostoevsky had fits of epilepsy, and in real life, he wrote the following to his doctor. He wrote, "My memory has grown completely dim. I don't recognize people anymore. I'm afraid of going mad or falling into idiocy." End of quote. I didn't understand the ending of the book at first. I wondered how, where's the logic? How would the prince end up drooling in a sanitarium, unable to recognize people just from, I don't know, the shock of seeing Natasha Felipena dead? He was so shocked that he became dumb or something? And the answer is, of course, that after every epileptic attack, the prince's brain function would deteriorate. Kind of like how Dostoevsky in real life thought the epilepsy was making him lose his memory. So either the prince had an epileptic attack while stroking Rogojin's hair, or it happened off-screen, or I don't know, maybe it didn't happen at all, but it was the epilepsy that caused the prince to end up demented at the end, and now I get that. When you read the book, pay close attention to how the prince describes his epileptic attacks, because this is really Dostoevsky describing his epileptic attacks. They were different from what I expected they would be like. He says they were usually preceded by overwhelming lucidity and an overwhelming love for life and people and nature and light. The narrator says, quote, "Immediately preceding them, he had always experienced a moment or two when his whole heart and mind and body seemed to wake up to vigor and light, when he became filled with joy and hope, and all his anxieties seemed to be swept away from forever. It was inexpressible. He would feel such extreme consciousness of himself, and consequently more of life than at any other times, due only to the disease, to the sudden rupture of normal conditions. Therefore, they are not really a higher kind of life, but a lower." Now, this is a personal tangent. I know this is kind of deviating from talking about the book, but I like the last sentence he says, quote, "Due only to the disease. They are not really a higher kind of life, but a lower." End of quote. I know of a lot of people who like smoke pot or have tried LSD, and they claim it is a religious experience and that everyone should try hallucinogenics because they, open your third eye. But I like how the prince says, well, you're having brain damage. It's not a higher kind of life, it's a lower kind. It's because of a disease. In your mind, you think you're closer to God, but it can never really be articulated in plain English when you come down from your high, because it never actually opened your eye. It tricked you into thinking it did. It's like, bipolar people going through a manic episode, they can sit right next to you and literally believe that they are the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. They can't really articulate it in plain English because they're not Jesus Christ. And meanwhile, their brain will be a carnival at that moment. It'll be a Christmas tree. It'll be fireworks inside their chemical reaction of their brain. But you sitting there next to them, you can clearly see they were never actually Jesus Christ. Back to the book. Dostoevsky also added another personal detail in the book. In the beginning of the book, the prince talks about a prisoner condemned to death who is pardoned moments before being executed. This snippet is the whole reason why I read the book. You see, Dostoevsky was condemned to death himself. He's the prisoner, and he was prepared for execution and was pardoned at the last second. In real life, this happened to Dostoevsky. It's truly an amazing story, and it was built up by those guys there's a YouTube channel, The School of Life. They have a really fun video about it that is kind of what convinced me to read this book. So that's a very personal part of Dostoevsky's real life that he added to this book, and it was very interesting seeing his description. It's amazing. So I had the ending of this book spoiled for myself. I knew how it was going to end, but I thought it would be like Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist type ending, where the main character goes on a long adventure only to find the treasure was home all along, and he would complete full circle and end up where he began. I thought, well, the idiot is going to end up poor again, I know that's going to happen, and he's going to end up in a sanitarium alone again, but at least he's going to have his love of life and a renewed appreciation for life. But no, that's not the case in this book. The prince was driven insane. He ended up a drooling vegetable. He was chewed up and spat out by 1960s Russia. And so that's the conclusion of Dostoevsky's simulation. He ran a simulation trying to see, what if you have a normal, varied cast of people, 1860s Russia, and you add to there somebody who truly practices what we're taught to do in church. What would end up happening? And the end result of his simulation was, well, society just completely destroys and bankrupts this person. And I really like, I think it was the Cliff Notes website, they talked about the ending, and that's when I finally kind of understood the ending. That, the prince was so loving that he would caress and sit next to Rogozhin after Rogozhin killed Natasha Felipena. And it is repulsive to see that. You are kind of like, Prince, what are you doing? Like, why are you showing love to this murderer who just did it? Why are you caressing his hair? Why are you crying? Why are your tears mixing with his? You are disgusted by it, and you see yourself in the mirror and you think, wow, I'm disgusted by true Christian love, the highest aspiration of man, Christian forgiveness. I find that repulsive now. It's a great book. It's a great book. One last thing I want to talk about is, was the prince a simp? Well, what is a simp, right? It's changed names a lot. Before it was called cuck, soy boy, numel, or white knight. Now they call it a simp. It's basically a man who will bend over backwards for women. It's a reoccurring theme with Dostoevsky to write about. He writes about a lot of simps. But in a way, Dostoevsky is saying that if you simp for a woman, she will destroy your life. Isn't that the moral of this story? And yet, in a way, the prince was not a simp. It's kind of this idea that, if you love everyone equally, then you don't really love anyone, right? You can't have unconditional love towards people. And you can't just base your love out of pity. This concept is less theoretical and more applicable to real life than you think. Okay? Think about it. How many people in the world do you think just settled for someone? How many people stay in a relationship just to not hurt the other person's feelings? How many men out there are opportunists who would cheat on their wives if only the opportunity presented itself? Well, the prince genuinely loved Aglaya and he genuinely loved Natasha Filipovna, so what does he do? Well, at the drop of a hat, he will leave one for the other. They just say, hey, do you want to get married? And he'll be like, yeah, whatever, yeah, I'll get married. But then he will just as easily leave them for another woman. That's the problem with unconditional love. You need conditions. You need standards. So I do have some criticisms for this book, and I do want to explain my criticisms now. So first of all, this book was boring at times. It's a very long book. Maybe I'm just dumb, because if you enjoy the book, then you'll enjoy all the meat of the book. But me personally, I thought it was too long. I also thought some of the symbolism was heavy-handed. Like Rogozhin was clearly going to be the prince's antithesis, both in appearance and in their relationship to Natasha. Also, all the foreshadowing about Rogozhin being Natasha Filipovna's death was pretty obvious. Stuff like that. But to be fair, I guess there's a lot of other parts where I tried to derive some symbolism, and I wasn't able to, because there was none. There were so many aspects that are just half measures in the book, inconclusive. There's not really commitment. It's not hardcore, So one big example of this is how the vast majority of the characters in the end were not weaved and orchestrated into a multi-layered complex narrative like a Seinfeld episode where, a plot A and plot B both tie back and resolve together at the end. No, none of that. In the end, Dostoevsky just listed a bunch of secondary characters and was like, yeah, their lives didn't really change, so I won't tell you their epilogue. Another thing I didn't like is that I don't think soliloquy stuff is realistic. I once watched that 1976 movie, The Network, which is a great movie, by the way. But a lot of those characters go on long rants that usually would take me right out of the movie. People in real life aren't, Shakespearean thespians who go on long monologues. And that happened a lot in this book. I'm not sure I can really penalize a classic work of literature for that, or for that matter, any of the other stuff I've mentioned before, all the other criticisms, but whatever. Finally, I don't usually like Hamlet endings, where everyone dies or goes insane at the end. This is the same reason why I don't like Korean movies, because every single Korean movie I've ever watched ends with everyone either dying or going insane. But I guess in this book's defense, it really wasn't all that gory of an ending. In fact, the gore was very contained and off-screen, but still. So, having said all of those criticisms, Dostoevsky is, well, to say he's a skilled writer would be an understatement. The man was a genius, and this book was quite a treat. Before I finish the video, I want to just note some interesting things that aren't related to anything, they don't fit anywhere, but I still think it's worth mentioning before I finish the video. I found it interesting that Hippolyte mentioned how Columbus died without knowing he discovered America. I didn't know that people had this information back in 1960s Russia, whether it's true or not. I also found it interesting where Aglaya's mom blames the women's rights question. That was interesting. I thought the adventures of little Evolgine and Napoleon was pretty fun. The part where Hippolyte accepts that he's going to die without leaving a single trace of his existence was pretty sad. That was touching. That was a touching part. I found it interesting how such a big theme of this book is marriages. Like Dostoevsky basically wrote a chick's novel. It's basically a romance novel. Oh, did you hear who's going to get married? Was it considered a chick's novel back then? I don't know. Probably not. I found it interesting how in the beginning of part 4 he mentions how girls might cut their hair short, put on blue spectacles, and call themselves nihilists just to not be seen as common and ordinary. And there was mention about it with Aglaya doing that. So I wonder if it was a common fad of the time, analogous to how girls in high school might dye their hair blue or suddenly subscribe to the goth or punk or SJW or emo scene just to have a flair about them. Moving on, I do wonder what would Natasha Filipovna had been in our modern world. You know, she's a fictional character. She represents a fallen woman groomed by a man, stolen of her virtue, and bent on self-destruction. Back then, fallen women did exist, and they were ostracized by society, you know, especially in higher circles, right? What would their modern equivalent be? You know, what would their post-sexual revolution equivalent be? If it was remade in our time, would Natasha Filipovna be a goth? That's what I'm wondering. Like, she wouldn't be like a hooker. Like, would she be like an SJW Tumblrina? Like, I'm wondering how that would happen in our society. And if you have an idea, please write it in the comments, I guess. I also wonder if Aglaya ever made the connection about the prince's inclination to help fallen women. The prince did tell them the story of how he tried to help the ostracized woman from Switzerland. So I wonder if, Aglaya ever made that connection. I do honestly believe, moving on, I do honestly believe, though, that Aglaya eventually reestablished contact with her family. You know, there's been so many flip-flops in the book and so many people forgiving others. I'm sure she eventually wrote back to them. Well, that concludes it. That concludes the discussion of the book The Idiot by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Please check out some of the other videos in my channel. If you like classic books, I also have a discussion on the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. And soon I will make a video discussing 7 books from H.G. Wells. I will try to compare them and rank them. So please, check out my video roster. I have a lot of, I discuss a lot of nonfiction books too. So please subscribe if you'd like to see that H.G. Wells video when it comes out. And if nothing else, thank you guys for watching. Bye.